Welcome, everyone. This is a CEO AMA. Ask me anything. And Neil, thanks for putting on the first question. Do you want to verbalize it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sid. So I've been here about a year and a half now, 18 months. I learned when I was being onboarded that we had a handbook with about 4,000 pages. It's pretty big. Now, this week, I've been quite involved. I learned we're up to almost 14,000. That was actually from June, so I'm sure we've hit that by now. Internally, we empathize with that. We understand what the value of having all this material is. It's a great resource. I'm wondering what the external perception of so much material looks like, if we understand that. A secondary question is, do we have qualitative data about this versus just number of pages?
Yeah, external perception seems to be positive, but a bit like hard to imagine. But I'm sure it's cool. That kind of vibe. I think so. It's something we use to kind of stress that we're really good at remote and that we're transparent. And as a data point for that, it works really well. We don't have a lot of qualitative data, like how do we use it? Is it better? I think the thing that worries me most is whether it's up to date. So I would see kind of the pace of changing stuff as the indicator of quality, not the number of pages.
And as I understand it, the number of pages is actually if we were to print the handbook, which is kind of interesting, versus number of actual web pages. I'm curious what was the idea behind that versus just saying we have this many linked pages?
Because it's hard to measure the actual number of web pages. Someone figured out a way to do that. That's fine too, but it is like the number of web pages depends on how you split the pages up, or the number of pages depends more on the word count, which I think is I think like the word count is the most accurate one, but as a human, it's really hard to have an idea for word count. Most people have an idea for how many words fit on in a book format. But we might say printed pages instead of pages to make sure we're talking about book pages instead of web pages.
We do, yes. It says printed pages. It says, yeah, number of words that would fit at 12-point font that would fit on a printed page. Cool. That makes sense. It just doesn't, that's not the way I think about web pages and content necessarily. I think more about what's the headline, what's the context of this page, how many of those do we have?
Yeah.
Thank you for some history.
It might be good if there's an easy command to kind of find out how many web pages there are. It might be good to add that as well.
Awesome. I will look into that. Thanks, Sid.
Thanks for asking. Alejandro?
I said, I have a bit of I think, a silly question. So I'm reading this book by a journalist, a New York Times journalist, Nicole Perlroth, something like that. And this is how they tell me the world ends. And it's basically a narrative on 0-day hacks, right? This person has been covering the history of these types of exploits for the past 10, 13 years. And as I'm reading it, I keep thinking like, oh my God, what a great target would be like GitLab, right? And our source code, since a lot of companies use our platform, right? And I was just wondering, I mean, I'm sure we look out for these types of attacks, but I was wondering if I don't know, what sort of strategies do we use, or is this something that keeps you up at night?
It's certainly something that it doesn't keep me up at night right now, because I think very highly of the teams we have in place to do it. It is a really good book. My wife works at HackerOne, and it's on the recommended reading list there. And it's I think she's listening to the audiobooks, so I get to listen along. I think the book is amazing. It does make you a bit paranoid, or maybe realistic, about how vulnerable everything is. And there's no perfect security. You can just try to make it harder to get in, and try to increase the chances that you'll detect something like that in an early stage. We have a lot of security practices. Maybe there's people who want to chime in after me. but things we do are kind of trying to fix our security vulnerabilities. We have a bug bounty on HackerOne if you find big security vulnerabilities. We even have an internal red team who acts like really skilled, really persistent hackers, and with try to get in. And I think with source code, just for clarification for other people listening, we don't mean the GitLab source code, which you can view online, but the source code that is entrusted to us from our users and customers, which many times is not public and we should keep very safe. And that tends to be an appealing target even for hackers. So we got a lot to live up to. Anybody else want to chime in? Does that answer your question, Alejandro? I can.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you too. Joe?
Thanks, Sid. We had a team day last week and a team member gave us a tour of a grocery store, Jumbo, in the Netherlands. We had a chance to see some of their favorite local foods and bread, cheeses, and desserts. So I'm curious, what are your favorite desserts back at home?
When I go back to the Netherlands and I visit a supermarket, I know I go to the borrelnootjes or tijgernootjes. They're coated peanuts, which are very tasty. And I go for the melkpijpjes, which is kind of I guess a sugary snack. My wife tends to buy a bunch of cheese, so a lot of Gouda cheese with some French Dijon mustard. Also, we love the bread a lot, although in San Francisco at Acme Bakery and stuff, there's really good bread as well. But I think in most supermarkets in the US, it's harder to get bread that is not sugary. That's been tough. But I must say, the only thing I consistently import is my hair gel, which I thought I wasn't vain, but apparently switching hair gel brands was too much for me. So if you wonder, L'Oreal Studio Line number 5. Sean?
Yeah, hey Sid. So I'm curious how you and the early team viewed bootstrapping GitLab versus taking VC money when GitLab was created. And then how, second question to that would be, how do you feel that's changed maybe in the current VC and startup environment, if at all?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I started the company, so it's kind of my decision. There's a couple of things that weighed in. First of all, it's harder to attract money if you're in Europe, but that's getting easier. I think another thing was when you attract outside capital, you kind of sign on to grow really fast and get to $1 billion and either sell the company or go public. So that as soon as you start taking other people's money, that's kind of what you sign up for. In the beginning, I wasn't kind of convinced that GitLab had that potential. Basically, what you're signing up to is a much higher risk of failure, but a much bigger outcome. But for me, like for me, the median case really mattered. Like, what's going to happen on average? So I don't want to fail. I'm going to spend a couple of years of my life. This might be kind of, I don't know, the last startup I do at that point. I wanted to succeed. And even if it's a small outcome, small in like 10 million range, that's like that would be life-changing for me. I don't need anything more than that. So I reduced risk, did that. And then I was intrigued by Y Combinator. We applied, we got in the program, but I told my wife, like, stop me if I want to take external money, because then I have to sign up for that. But then going through YC, you see all the ambition of all the other people, and I'm sensitive to that. Like, what are my peers doing? And you start kind of believing like we could do it. And it has the potential. So then we ended up taking external money. one more factor I think is very important is open source projects take a bit longer to mature. And with open source, you create more value than you capture. So you need a little bit more time. And this initial investment, I put about 100,000 in myself, kind of bought us a couple of years to kind of mature the open source, create a ton of value. And so that when we started raising external money, we could just capture it. If you raise money early as an open source startup from investors who don't get open source startups, you might be forced to capture too much value, which kind of kills the open source project or makes it less likely to thrive. Thanks for asking, Mike.
Hi, Sid. In a past AMA, you talked about, sorry, I guess they're doing a fire drill. You talked about getting the core metrics right being really important. I was curious what the core metrics were that you focused on at the start of GitLab and what they would be if you started today knowing what you know now. Yeah,
I think during YC, we learned, hey, focus on one number. And what we should have done, we should have focused on revenue. We were like, oh, we made up this very elaborate story, which was, it takes like 2 years between kind of adopting GitLab and us getting revenue. So in these 3 months at YC, we cannot influence revenue that much. So we're going to focus on downloads instead, and we're going to try to have more people install the product. And then we weren't able to grow that really fast, whatever we tried. And then we focused on revenue and we were able to grow that fast. So in hindsight, we were just kind of, we were afraid to kind of do revenue. We thought it would be harder and turned out to be easier and more influenceable. And if I look at an open source startup, in the beginning, you need contributions, you need other people to be excited about it and form a community. Then you need usage, a ton of usage on your platform, and then you need revenue. So I go through those stages. Drew has a follow-on.
Yeah, what you said about focusing on one number is kind of interesting. Do you still think that's a good idea? I just immediately thought about the risk of focusing on too many numbers and not, being focused or driven enough against the risk of picking exactly one number and having it be the wrong number, and then you go off in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and what you need to do in the early days is kind of, you need to iterate, and you need to take things that in a normal company take 6 months and do them in 6 days. And the only way to do that is to force yourself to focus on one number, right? If you focus on revenue, you want to grow 10% every week. That is super hard. You're like, how are we going to grow it this week, right? And you're forced to kind of examine all the things you could do and then think about, okay, how can we get a part of that effect in a couple of days instead of a couple of months? And that allows you to kind of rapidly experiment and see what works and double down there. So I think it's very healthy. I think if you have too many numbers, it doesn't force you to kind of compress long projects in short timeframes. And that's what you need to do to experiment and find out how you can, what works and what your business really is.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Nuritsi.
All right, I'm wondering more about the process that you use to create long-term strategies for the company. How do you approach this type of task?
That's a good question. And you've been with me in the call with Scott. And together we talked about the product strategy for 10 years. And what I asked him is like, hey, we have a great 3-year strategy. We need a 10-year strategy. And we're looking at kind of expanding the number of use cases that we cater to. I think it was important in that strategy to also call out kind of the shorter strategy, the 3-year strategy, not duplicate it, but call it out. And then I guess there's not kind of a consistent way to come up with something like that. And I think it's what I suggested is to have a look at how kind of DevOps, model ops, and data ops come together. And then Scott looked at model ops, it didn't include data ops, but then Kenny suggested, without me prompting, to also look at data ops. So that was cool. So it's kind of a collaboration. And then we'll at some point we'll have an MR. We'll get other people who say like, okay, well, I don't see this future. I do see this future. So I guess it's multiple ideas. Try to phrase the ideas as good as we can and expose it to a large group. Get feedback on them. I'm trying to think why I think that DevOps is gonna kind of go into model ops and data ops. I think like you'd be hard pressed living in tech the last 5 years to not see the major influence of ML and AI. And ML and AI is kind of hard to train, and to train it, you need better data. And most ML AI people spend a ton of time on cleaning up their data sets. So I think you can see that, and you can see that the most important or very important pieces of new software are getting just more models. We had our acquisition of Unreview. If you look at self-driving, it's a combination of procedural code and trained models. And I think that was when we made our own data strategy as GitLab, we saw like, wow, this is kind of a mess. And we made Meltano to help with that. So that's how that came together.
Thanks. And just a small follow-up on that. So typically we have had the 3-year strategy. At what point in a company's maturity do you think it makes sense to have a 10-year, or why did you decide to do that now?
Oh, I got a bit nerdy about all the different timeframes in the company. So I thought it was fun to kind of look at the different cadences. And then I try to nail them down, and I try to kind of have, I don't know, between 3x to 5x, kind of have 4x between them. 4 to 5x is a good ratio. It's not too big, not too small. Same ratio between our pricing, by the way, which is weird, but whatever. So going from a day to a week is 5x. From a week to a month is 4.3 to a quarter, 4 quarters in a year, and 3 years for strategy, a 10-year vision, and then a 30-year mission. And then I try to just find data points to support that. So you just Google the lifespan of an average company is 3 years. Amazon talks about 30 plus years. A generation in humanity is 30 years. I thought that was an appropriate kind of size. And then we have a 3-year strategy. I think it's also important to kind of have a vision, especially to kind of think beyond that, and also see what where we're investing for the long run. It doesn't mean it's a giant investment today, but it does mean we're probably starting to invest there.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks for asking.
All right, we are going to stop the public